this webinar. We look forward to answering any questions and giving you some good information. I'll be talking about the new kidney allocation and the UNOS waitlist. As many of you know, the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network was created by the US Congress through the passing of the National Organ Transplant Act in 1984. And the OPTN implements organ allocation policies across the country. And these are based on utility, like prognosis and survival of patients, and or justice, time waiting, severity of illness, and access to care. The OPTN has multiple goals, including increasing the number of transplants, providing equity in access to transplant, as well as improving as well as improving the wait list outcomes, as well as donors and recipient outcomes. Now, specific to kidney transplantation, the wait list is mostly based on time waiting. And approximately 100,000 patients are waiting for kidneys in the US right now. And we managed to transplant a little more than 15,000 kidneys per year for the past 3 years from deceased donors. Actually, in 2020, that number has gone as high as 17,000. But again, compared to 100,000, we essentially don't have enough kidneys. The OPTN, to facilitate the allocation of organs and a lot of their work, they divide the country into 11 regions, as you see here. Every region is a few states adjacent to each other and working closely. And each region is further divided into what's called the donor service area, or DSA. Each donor service area is managed by an OPO, or organ procurement organization, commonly known as organ banks. And each organ bank will get the organs coming from every hospital within its DSA, and they allocate these organs after. So this system has been going on since the 80s, as I mentioned. And there was a big change that happened at the end of 2014, in December 2014 to be exact. And that's what's called the kidney allocation system. We'll talk a little bit about the reasons behind it, which are primarily the fact that we had a lot of kidneys not being utilized from deceased donors. There was a lot of variability in access to transplantation, especially in minorities. There were unrealized graft years, so kidneys that have more years that are lost, as well as a high retransplant rate. So we'll talk a little further about these. First starting with the graft years. And this shows us the percent of kidneys failed for each transplant year, going from 91 to 2012, at 6 months, 5 years, and 10 years. And let's focus on 5 years for a second. Here in the dark green, you see the percent of kidneys lost overall. And in the light green are the kidneys lost when the patient returned to dialysis, compared to kidneys lost because the patient died while their kidney was still functioning. While this blue line shows that it's a great opportunity for the patient as they got a kidney for the remainder of their life, occasionally, if a kidney has, for example, 7 or 8 years of life, and after it got transplanted into a patient, that patient only survived 5 years, we essentially lost 2 or 3 years of the life of that kidney. So while it's great for that patient specifically, for the overall good, that's not an ideal outcome. And if that kidney went into somebody who has more years to survive, that would have been better. And you see, while we're getting better and there's a decrease in the percent of patients returning to dialysis, that percent of patients dying with a functioning graft is steady to slightly increasing, as you see here. And at the same time, the data showed that different age groups, as we see here on the left, and different diagnosis groups for kidney disease, as we see on the right, were getting transplants at similar rates. You see all the lines together. Patients' PRA, or sensitization, made a big difference in the likelihood of getting a transplant. So as you see here, patients with low PRA, these are patients who are not sensitized, and patients, as many of you know, get sensitized by having prior transfusions, prior organ transplant, or women by having multiple pregnancies. This is a situation where the patient becomes more sensitized. They have a higher PRA. So a patient who has a PRA of 80%, what that means is that 80% of kidneys available do not suit them and cannot be transplanted into them, and only 20% can. So these are tougher to match patients, and they're essentially getting transplants at a lower rate compared to others. The other thing that the CAS implemented is the kidney donor profile index. We identified kidneys based on the quality of these kidneys. And there are kidneys that are essentially top quality. So this is 1 percentile. And then what we would call the least good kidney, these would be the 99th percentile. What that means is a 30%, for example, kidney is essentially better than 70% of kidneys transplanted that year. And even you see the least good kidneys that we're talking about with the 99%, they still make it to 1 year at 86% of the time and make it 5 years half the time. So while the 1% kidney is obviously better than that, these kidneys are still very good quality kidney for certain patients and would be an opportunity to help those patients. And that's the other piece that the CAS looked into, which is the EPTS, estimated post-transplant survival. So they looked at patients after transplant, and the top 20% of patients, they made it at 90% of the time, made it at 8 years after transplant. Whereas the bottom 20% of patients, half of them died within 8 years after transplant. So that gives you the ideas where the kidney allocation system got to, in addition to factoring in the sensitization points. So prior to CAS, patients who are 80% sensitized would get 4 points. Each point is equal to 1 year waiting. But similarly, patients who are 99 or almost 100% sensitized, they would also get 4 points. That changed with CAS, and now the point system is logarithmic. And you see patients at 98% sensitized, for example, get 17 points. Patient at about 87% sensitized, they get 4 points, similar to what they did before. And the most important change with CAS was factoring in waiting time. So prior to CAS, waiting time was started at the day the patient was added to the waiting list. What changed is for patients who were on dialysis prior to being added to the waiting list, all their time on dialysis is added to their waiting time. So now the waiting time is essentially the defaults to the day they started dialysis, or they're added to the list, whichever is earlier. And then the allocation by CAS was in 4 sequences based on the KDPI of kidneys. So the top 20% of kidneys were sequence A, 20 to 35B, 35 to 85C, and A greater than 85 is D. You see the highly sensitized patients came across the board. So these were offered the kidneys first because they're toughest to match, and in essence, they're least likely to accept them. So the kidney many times end up going to the next sequence, which comes to the perfectly matched recipients. And you see the top 20% of kidneys preferentially went to the top 20% of patients. Prior living donors, if they ever need a kidney, that's extremely, extremely rare, but they get a priority right here. Then the pediatrics patients, which get priority on the 0 to 20 and 20 to 35. Then you see the local top 20, the rest of the patient, and then it goes to the local allocation. And you see all the local allocation comes first, then the regional, and then finally the national. So the kidney is offered within the DSA that I showed you earlier, then in the region, then across the country. And there are many other changes. One of the important ones to mention is blood type B recipients got a chance to capture donors from a specific blood type A if they have low antibodies. And that all these pieces added together created value for CAS by sharing for sensitized patient, essentially decreasing inequity for sensitized patient and decreasing inequity for ethnic minorities, as these patients were more likely to be referred late to transplantation and after being on dialysis for years. So now they get their dialysis initiation date as their listing date or their qualified time waiting date. Similarly, many African Americans are blood type B, and that gives them a chance to capture donors capture kidneys from donors who are non-A1. And finally, as we mentioned, the top quality kidneys were given to top quality patients, so increasing the longevity of the kidneys. Now, despite that these all went into effect in 2014, the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the OPTN, had the final rule on organ allocation implemented in 2000, talking about sound medical judgment and best utilization of organs to drive organ allocation, but also mentioned that organ allocation shall not be based on the candidate's place of residence or place of listing. Well, a couple of years after CAS went into effect, we looked at the data, and that wasn't the case. You see here the map of the country with different colors depicting the median time, the average time the patients waited for a kidney. And you see there are certain parts in light blue, like upstate New York, the Midwest, and part of the Northwest here, where patients waited less than 2.5 years for a kidney. Compare that to certain parts of like New York City, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, parts of Texas, parts of California, where the waiting time was upward of 5.5 years. And that's where essentially we're not following the final rule. And for that reason, there was a new allocation system that was implemented last year. It really didn't go into effect until March 15, 2021, about actually exactly 3 months ago. And now the DSAs and the regions are no longer part of the allocation. So to avoid kidneys traveling too far, to say we're not going to put kidneys for everybody across the country, they created this circle of 250 nautical miles. It's a little more than 250 miles, and the circle center is in the donor hospital. So all the recipient hospitals or transplant centers within 250 nautical miles from a donor will get first opportunity for these kidneys. So for example, you look at New England, and in the red dots in here on the map are the transplant centers in New England, which primarily we used to get organ offers from New England. Now we're getting organ offers from New York, upstate New York, even down to Jersey and Philly. Now, there is some prioritization. A lot of the CAS prioritization is still in effect. And the proximity points was added. So for example, if this is the donor hospital, as I mentioned, this is 250 nautical mile circle. If this donor hospital was a transplant center and there's somebody waiting at this hospital, that patient will get 2 extra points. Halfway through the circle, this patients at this hospital get 1 point. If there is a hospital right at the edge of the 250 nautical mile, these patients will get 0 points. Now, patients outside the circle, they do get 4 points, but they're allocated after the circle first. And I'll show that in a minute. This is the allocation sequences, which are very similar to what we have with CAS. So 0 to 20, 20 to 35, 35 to 85, then greater than 85. And you see the highly sensitized is still on top. The perfectly matched comes next. Prior living donors. Then instead of local, now we have this 250 nautical mile. And within the 250 nautical mile, each patient gets a score, which I will describe in the next slide. And then what's interesting is that this regional allocation now disappeared, so it's all crossed off. And after the circle, the 250 nautical mile, the allocation goes to national allocation. So for example, this is the similar map, and now we're only pointing to MGH here in Boston, and you see that all the donor hospitals. And this is the kidney allocation score, so how do patients rank on the waiting list? So again, waiting time drives the majority of it. CPRA points, as I showed you earlier, this is not a good way to get points, but it's one way to get points. DR matching, so this is specific to the donor, and then the distance points, as we described, are all added together, and that's how the order of patients go on the waiting list. So this changed a few things. As I said, New York is within our circle, so we're sharing organs with New York. And New York had, as you saw from the earlier slide, a longer waiting time. So patients in New York are getting more opportunities, not only from New England, but also from the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic. And that's the idea, that these circles overlap in a way that in a few years, hopefully a couple of years or shorter, the country will have more similar waiting times across the board, that we will get to that point and not have these significant differences across state lines. So what do we recommend? There are ways to decrease waiting time. You got to work with your own center to understand the specifics of your region and what's going on. There are many deceased donor options, as we talked about decreased utilization of deceased donor organs. We talked a lot about to our patient about the PHS increased risk donors. We've been using those regularly. The chance of transmitting disease is extremely low, that these are great opportunity. We've talked about expanded criteria donors in the past. Now they're called high KDPI donors. We've used kidneys when they have acute injury related to the death of the donor, but the kidney is still a great kidney and worth utilizing. Hepatitis C virus, and we use HIV positive donors for HIV positive recipients. But really, one of the best ways to get a kidney is through living donation, which Dr. Safa will be talking to you about next, and I'm glad to answer any questions later on.
Thank you, Dr. Elias. So I'm going to hand the remote control over to Dr. Safa now. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Elias, for this nice tour de force about the new allocation system. So what I'm going to go after is what do you need to know about living kidney donation? What are the advantages? What are the myths? And some frequently asked questions that we would be able to answer later on. So as Dr. Elias mentioned, the state of the transplant in the United States, close to 100,000 patients are on the wait list. This is from a nice piece in the Wall Street Journal from 2014. It's still valid in 2021, unfortunately. Only close to 20,000 kidney transplants happen per year. So automatically, you'll have increase in waiting times. Why everybody wants a kidney transplant? Obviously, it's the better option. It offers a survival advantage. In red, you see the survival of patients on dialysis. In gray, you see the survival of patients with transplant. And this is mortality, which is the higher the mortality it is, the worse. And you can see almost 4 times the mortality of dialysis compared to transplant over the years, and that has been steady. The second advantage is the quality of life advantage. And this is a study from close to 1 million patients, multiple studies compiled together, and across a wide spectrum of quality of life parameters, including physical activity, including social functioning, general health, mental health. You see that transplant, which is on the right side, is much, much more favorable than being on dialysis. And the advantage that is not well known or popular is that kidney transplant costs much less than dialysis. And you can see in 2018, the cost of dialysis per year is almost more than double the cost of kidney transplantation. So why waiting is not ideal? One would say, I would wait my time to get a kidney transplant. Why waiting is not ideal? And this is a really nice slide from the last UNOS report, data report, where it shows if you are listed in 2016 for a kidney transplant, where were you in 2019 at the end of the 2019? And in blue, in purple, it shows you the patients who were still waiting for a kidney transplant, and that's close to 40%. And in dark yellow is those who were removed from the list, and that's close to 20%. And then those who were deceased, unfortunately, these were in blue. So if you combine those who are still waiting or deceased or removed from the list, that's close to 70%. So that's in 3 years into waiting. Is that bad to wait on dialysis before kidney transplant? Actually, there are studies that show the longer you wait on dialysis, the worse you do after kidney transplantation. And this is, for example, a study that shows the survival, how long you live without any events such as death or cardiovascular event. And that is following patients over more than 10 years, which is a very solid study. And it showed that if you get a kidney transplant preemptively, which means before reaching dialysis, you have much better survival than after dialysis. And the longer you stay on dialysis, as you can see, it's worse survival-wise. And there's another study which compared, actually, it's an interesting study which compared the same kidneys from the same deceased donor that went either to someone who was before dialysis or 0 to 6 months in dialysis on the top graph versus those who were more than 2 years on dialysis. And you see the survival is almost cut in half at 10 years in those who waited more than two years on dialysis. So the bottom line is the longer a recipient waits on dialysis for kidney transplant, the less benefit they get from the organ. And kidney transplantation that occurs before reaching the need for dialysis leads to the best long-term survival. So really, as Dr. Elias mentioned, the options are very limited, especially with the new allocation system, with the new nautical mile system that has led to more waiting time in our region, especially skipping the long line. And this is an image from Mount Everest a couple of years ago where people are lining up to reach the summit. The only option would be living donor kidney transplant. And it, along with skipping the wait time, it has a lot of other advantages. As I mentioned, the wait time is abolished or diminished. It allows for the preemptive kidney transplant. As we mentioned, this is the best option before you reach the point where you need dialysis, not when you're too healthy, but not when you're on dialysis. It offers an immediate function advantage. By that, I mean the kidney will work immediately more than 95% of the times when you put it, when a recipient get it from a living donor, as opposed as close to 60% from kidneys that come from deceased donors. It has a longer half-life, which means kidneys that come from a living donor will last on average more than kidneys that come from a deceased donor. And the half-life we mentioned roughly is about 17 years for a living donor versus close to 11 years for deceased donors. It offers superior outcomes. So when you compare all those who get a living donor kidney transplant versus those who get a deceased donor kidney transplant, on the longer term, those who get living donor kidney transplant have a better survival. It has a major advantage that is a little bit not emphasized on, but it's really important. It becomes an elective surgery. When the recipient is ready to get a transplant and the donor is approved, we make a call to both parties and we schedule electively the surgery, and both members of the pair show up on a preset date without in the morning, and things happen scheduled and they're neatly planned, as opposed as a call often at 2 in the morning on a Friday or Saturday night, put some stuff in a bag and come, we have an organ for you. Not that it's a bad call to hear, but still neatly planned would eliminate the element of surprise. And finally, which is a very important factor, is that a kidney, living donor kidney transplant will allow for paired exchange for incompatible pairs. For example, if you have a donor that is not same blood type or different antigens, or the recipient has antibodies against this donor, or wide age discrepancy, or different location, I'll mention that briefly later. Living donor kidney transplant will allow you to enter in a paired exchange, which allow incompatible pairs to move forward with kidney transplant. So what are the most common, quickly, myth and misconceptions that circulate around, and we get asked a lot about them? Is one, I'm not a match with my recipient. The donor will tell us that, and they won't apply. Or for example, a recipient saying it's too risky. I don't want to take a kidney from someone I love. Or for example, my donor cannot afford the costs. Or you know what, it's been a long year with the pandemic. I would like to take my chances, wait and wait until the pandemic ends, and then we'll take it from there. So point by point, and we will be able to answer questions at the end as well about any nuances or any granularities that the attendants would like to learn about. So for example, the first myth, I must match with my recipient to become a donor. That is absolutely not necessary. Anyone who's healthy and willing can be evaluated to become a donor. And as a reminder, we at Mass General have an active and the largest paired exchange or swap program in Region 1. We do swaps for people who are blood type incompatible. So let's say you're blood type O and your donor is blood type A, or your donor is blood type B. We can enter into a swap program. We do swaps for patients who are HLA incompatible. For someone, for example, who got a lot of blood transfusion or had a prior kidney transplant, they may have antibodies against their donor. So that pair can enter through a swap program, and a kidney where the recipient doesn't have antibody against can become available. Age incompatibility, so which means someone who is 25 or 30 years old is a recipient and their donor is in their 60s, we could enter into a swap whereby the recipient will get a kidney from a younger donor, and that kidney coming from an older donor would go to someone in the chain that either require that specific donor or closer to the age. Location incompatible is a relatively new, over the last couple of years, new member that entered into the swap, where if someone has a donor, a friend or family member who lives as far as Hawaii, let's say, or West Coast, or San Diego, for example. It was an example where we had a donor who lived in San Diego and a recipient who was in Boston, and we managed to enter them through a swap where the donor remotely donated and the kidney was flown over to Mass General through the same swap program. And there is the timing incompatibility, and that is really valid for couples or husbands and wives or people who are the caregivers of each other, where, for example, a pair, for example, has kids and they can't take time off at the same time to go through the surgery. The donor, for example, the wife will donate ahead of time to the pool, and the pool later on, once the donor is recovered and is able to help the husband, for example, to recover from their surgery, the pool will give back a kidney to the husband. So there's a lot of options. Anyone healthy and willing can be evaluated to become a living donor, and we are happy to evaluate these candidates. The second myth, it's too risky. I don't want to receive a kidney from someone I love. And this is where I always mention to recipients, and I learned that from one of our senior transplant nephrologists in the past, that it takes two people to make Christmas happen. One has to give the gift, but one has to receive the gift. If no one takes the gift, there wouldn't be Christmas. I have to tell you, the donor candidates go through a really rigorous evaluation. It leaves no stones unturned. There's a really big dedicated team that goes over every abnormal lab, every abnormal record to make sure they can donate a kidney. And at any point when we have doubts about the feasibility of the donation, we do not move forward with that. The risk of dying from donating a kidney is about or less than the risk of dying from a cesarean section surgery or gallbladder removal surgery. So it's pretty safe surgery. The risk is not zero, obviously, but it's really low. It's less than 3 in 10,000. I have to mention that the vast majority of donors have a perfectly normal health after donation without problem. Once they recover, they can carry a completely normal life. What about the long-term risk of developing kidney disease? It's really pretty rare. The long-term absolute risk of developing advanced kidney disease if you donate a kidney is small. It's close to 30 in 10,000. It goes up from 4 in 10,000 to 30 in 10,000. So it's pretty minimal, especially when we select the donors, specifically ruling out chronic conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, or other cardiovascular problems. Another myth that recipients worry about, or some donors actually are not motivated to step forward, is like they can't afford the cost. I don't have, my insurance won't cover it. We have to make sure the recipients and the donors know that the evaluation, the testing, the appointments, and the surgery, and the follow-up, and anything that is related to the donation is covered by the recipient insurance, and the donor does not incur a cost out of pocket for that. However, there is some travel and accommodation expenses, as well as parking expenses that could be a significant amount of money for some donors. We have resources now through the HRSA, through the National Living Donor, the NALDAC program, where we can help donors through this nonprofit organization to cover these expenses. Another recent myth that is really relevant to the pandemic here is that I should wait until the COVID-19 pandemic to get the transplants situated. I think I'll wait it out. There's too much going on. I have to mention that we have data now that as of last year with the pandemic, the mortality or the death rate on the wait list has increased. And the reason why is we did less kidney transplants. We are very fortunate here that we have a vaccine that is widely available for healthy people, for dialysis patients, and even for patients with advanced kidney disease and their family members. So, and the vaccine is very effective when taken before transplant. The risk of catching COVID-19 is really minimal. The hospital has done tremendous effort to minimize that risk with testing, with the precautions, with the universal precautions. So, it's not worth it to say I don't want to do the surgery just because I'm worried to catching COVID-19 in the hospital. And then the last thing that is really important is we have a structured protocol that we screen our donors and recipients before the transplant with symptoms and with the testing, just to try to make sure no one has the infection before going through kidney transplant. So just to summarize, living donor kidney transplant is really the superior modality to treat advanced kidney disease. It has better survival, better quality of life, and is much more cost effective. Living donation is very safe with minimal risk on the donor. The donor candidates go through a rigorous workup before being approved to becoming a donor. Incompatible pairs can benefit from paired exchange transplants when they have recipients when they have a living donor. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Elizabeth Gigliotti, and we will be answering questions toward the end.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Elizabeth, and I'm one of the living donor nurse coordinators. I'm going to go over some tips and information about how to find a living donor. Some of my initial slides we've already chatted about a little bit, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. So again, why is it important to find a living donor? It's less time on the waiting list for the recipient, so you'll be healthier at the time of transplant. You might be able to avoid going on dialysis altogether, which is our hope, but at least spend less time on dialysis. On average, the kidneys from living donors perform better and last longer. And then you can plan your life around when the transplant takes place. So, you know, if you have a family wedding that's coming up, or, you know, work things that you want to work around, then we can take that into account when we're scheduling the surgery, instead of, again, getting called in the middle of the night saying, come to the hospital right now, we have a deceased donor transplant for you. So when we're looking at living donor candidates, how do we decide who's a good candidate? So these are very general overview of who makes a good candidate, and there are certainly specific things that would also rule somebody out for being a donor. But in general, we're looking at somebody who is an adult, so age 18 to 75. Just as a note, if you do use social media, or the person who comes forward as a potential donor for you doesn't actually know you, they're a friend of a friend of a friend, or just found you from a billboard or something like that, then we do ask that donors are at least 25 years old. And that's just because there's less of a relationship between the donor and recipient. We don't want a donor who's particularly obese, so we do look for a body mass index less than 35. No major health conditions such as diabetes, especially, and heart, lung, and liver diseases. No recent cancer, other than some, you know, superficial skin cancers are usually fine. But other than that, any donor who's had cancer in the past, we'd need to see a period of being in remission before we can move ahead. All donors need to stop any oral contraceptives or any kind of smoking for a period of time before and after donation. The donor needs to be able to take time off to recover from the donation surgery. And if a donor has high blood pressure or a history of having kidney stones, it doesn't mean that they're ruled out automatically. We have some additional testing we can do to see whether they're a good candidate or not. What isn't important, we already kind of touched on this a little bit. So being the same blood type or compatible blood type is less important. Matching, which was more important before the medications that recipients take after transplant got better. Now that's really not as important. The difference in age between the donor and recipient, and the distance between the donor's home and Mass General, is really not as much of an issue these days. And we can utilize the paired exchange if the donor and recipient are not compatible for one of those reasons. So just a brief little overview of the paired exchange. The swaps often start with a non-directed donor, so someone who just says, I want to be a donor for somebody, and doesn't have a particular recipient in mind. And then each of these up and down pairs are incompatible pairs. So it's, you know, it could be that donor one is, you know, blood type A and recipient one is blood type O. It could be an age difference. So that non-directed donor would give to recipient one, donor one would give to recipient two, and so on and so forth. And most of that, the whole swap would happen in a short period of time. So it's not that your donor donates and then you have to wait a long time before your transplant would happen. In terms of what information should you share when you're trying to find a living donor? We think it is important to make it somewhat personal. So how has kidney disease affected you particularly in your life? Including facts about kidney disease, living donation, and transplant can be helpful because a lot of people really don't know much about the process and how it works. And including a photo on a social media post or a website can also generate some greater engagement. So get more people personally interested in potentially being a donor for you. But really the take home message through this whole thing is to only share information that you feel comfortable sharing. Some basic information about kidney disease and transplant. Again, a little bit of an overview. So nearly 100,000 people on the wait list for a deceased donor kidney transplant in the United States. The wait time for a deceased donor transplant can be somewhere between 2 to 6 years on average, can be higher, can be lower, mostly dependent on the recipient's blood type. And dialysis is a treatment for kidney disease, but not a cure. In terms of information about living donation that you can share, so you really only need one kidney to live a long, healthy life, assuming that you are a generally healthy person as a donor. The donor evaluation is very thorough to make sure the donor is not only at low risk of complications from the surgery, but at low risk for developing complications related to only having one kidney for the rest of their life. There is a totally separate donor team, including an independent living donor advocate, whose job it is to make sure that the donor understands the whole process, they know what they're getting into, and our job on the donor team is really to make sure that this is in the donor's best interest to move ahead with the surgery. The donor surgery is done laparoscopically, so it's tiny little incisions. It's not the big long incision like they did initially when they first started doing kidney donations. And donors are usually in the hospital for just 1 to 3 days and usually back doing their normal activities within 1 to 2 months. And we've had donors who within a year after donation are doing triathlons and back to their normal activities. And, unless they see their recipient or it comes around time for their kidneyversary, they don't remember. It's not something that comes to them all the time being like, oh yeah, I was a kidney donor. The cost of the donor evaluation and surgery is covered by the recipient's insurance, and there are some programs that can help with the additional expenses like travel and accommodation. And the donor candidate can change their decision at any point in the process. We make that very clear to them. So who should you share your story with? And this is going to be very dependent on you, but some ideas, family and friends are usually good people to initially start out with. We found that the closer the connection between donor and recipient, the more likely that someone is to be motivated to make it through the process relatively quickly. Coworkers can be a good option, but do be cautious, especially if you're a manager for somebody. We don't want there to be some kind of power differential where they feel like it would be important or help them out and work to come forward as a donor. So just keep that in mind. Community groups can be a great way to spread the word. So if you're active in a church or if you go to a gym frequently, posting a flyer or something like that so that people know that you're looking for a donor can be very helpful. And then social media, of course, has become a big way to share your story, especially recently. And there are pros and cons to it that I'll talk a little bit about. And spreading the word is important, but do keep in mind that any information that you share, especially if you're using a website or social media, consider that information to be on the internet forever. So you want to make sure you're not sharing information that you wouldn't be comfortable with everybody seeing forever. How can you share your story? Certainly plenty of ways. So sharing the information in person, via telephone calls, emails, or letters directly to people. Flyers can be a good way to spread the word where you can just post them up again at church, a gym, at your workplace, things like that. Car window, lawn signs, billboards, things like that can be a way to expand the audience even further. And I'll show some examples of that in a little bit. A social media post, or through a donation champion. So that could be somebody, whether it's a family member or a friend, who, if you don't feel particularly comfortable sharing your story directly with people, you can kind of assign somebody who's your champion to find a living donor. And that person can spread the word for you. And again, sharing your story is a very personal decision. So whatever methods you feel comfortable using, go ahead and give them a try. Some important points to remember. It's often a good idea to tell potential donors to contact the Mass General donor team directly instead of you acting as an intermediary, just because it minimizes the chance that that the donor might feel a little pressure. So having them contact us directly is usually the best way to do it. And we would recommend avoiding using specific coordinator names or contact information, so direct phone numbers or emails. We do have general donor team information, so the email address of mghlivingdonors@partners.org, or the website that takes donors to the donor questionnaire is mghlivingdonors.org. So relatively easy to remember. There can be absolutely no coercion of donor candidates, so no pressure, whether that's from the recipient or from a donation champion. The donor needs to be making this decision on their own free will. And there can be no financial incentive for donor candidates. So that means, no offering to pay them if they're a donor, no offering to send them on a big vacation. Recipients are allowed to cover donor costs such as travel expenses for appointments or donation, or wages lost during surgical recovery. So it's more that recipients can help minimize the disincentives to donation. So reasons why donors, even if they wanted to be a donor, may not be able to for financial reasons. Recipients can help with that, but they can't offer anything above and beyond the costs of donation. So now I'm going to have some samples that I'm just going to run through pretty quickly, and I'm going to highlight certain parts of it. So this is a sample letter coming from a recipient to potential donors, and the parts I thought were important are getting regular dialysis treatments, usually 3 times a week for 4 hours at a time, will help my kidneys do their job and keep me alive, but a transplant would offer me more freedom and the ability to live a longer, healthier, more normal life. A transplant would also give me more time to do the fun things I enjoy the most, like spending time with family or friends. So again, that personal connection where, this is how my life is going to be on dialysis, and this is how a transplant could help. And then I know living donation may not be right for everyone, but you can still help. Consider being an organ donor after death. It's a great way to spread the word there. And also help by sharing my story with people that you know, so that we can bring awareness to kidney disease and living donation. So even just things like that lessen the pressure on a particular donor and give them a way that they might be able to help even if they aren't able to donate themselves. Here's another sample letter. And the important parts here, again, dialysis treats my kidney disease. I have to go to the dialysis center for 4 hours, 3 times a week. It can be really hard on people physically and emotionally. Giving some information about donation, how long the wait time is. A living donor can be a family member, friend, or anyone who is healthy and volunteers to donate. They don't need to be the same blood type. And then, I never thought I'd be asking for this kind of help, but please know I'll respect whatever you decide. And that's very important. Again, you want to spread the word, but you don't want people to think that you are, expecting anything of them. This letter is an example that would be coming from a donation champion or a friend or family. So again, it's not an easy letter for me to write, but I know without sending this, someone who might be interested in helping won't have that opportunity. Or I know this is a big request, but I make it on behalf of someone who devotes every day of his life to making a difference to his family and friends. So little things like that can really, make the point. Here's another one from the donation champion. So, sorry, that's actually the same one. The recipient has end-stage kidney disease or kidney failure and has 3 options: dialysis, a deceased donor transplant, or a living donor transplant. Dialysis is a temporary solution, and while they can remain on dialysis for many years, it's not a cure for kidney disease. It's physically exhausting, time-consuming, things like that. So that information can be helpful for people who don't understand the process in general. And again, this person needs a new kidney. I hope you consider being tested to be a donor. It's a big request, but I make it on behalf of someone who makes a big help. In terms of flyers, again, they can be a helpful way to kind of just post the information. People can look at it when they have time. And churches or community newsletters are a good way to get the information out as well. So these little blurbs tend to be a little bit shorter. So again, living kidney donor needed. Our friend learned they need a transplant, and the kidney from a living donor is their best chance. Providing the email or the website address to go to the questionnaire. And then if they need additional information, we do have just the Mass General Living Donor website, which is a little more bulky, but not too bad. And again, here's just some examples for church bulletins. So, so-and-so was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease. If you're healthy, age 18, this is 18 to 70. So we go up to 75 and willing to donate a kidney, they may be able to accept the transplant. Flyers, these are some examples of what the flyers can look like. I will say, I did try to get rid of all the phone numbers here. Putting the blood type is not entirely necessary again, but having the tear off strips is not a bad idea, especially if someone, can't just want something quick that they can look at later. But it is helpful. The potential donor is going to need to know what your name is. So if you have tear off strips, putting your name on that tear off strip would be helpful, or providing a link to a website that they can go to. Lawn signs can be a way to spread the word, especially if your house or someone you know's house is on a road that gets traveled by a lot of people. And this example here is actually one of our Mass General recipients who found a donor through a lawn sign, and their information was written up in the Cape Cod Times in 2016. So, just saying needed a kidney donor, here's the person's name, their phone number, email address, things like that could be helpful. Billboards can be a way if you feel like it. It's going to require much less information, especially if the billboard is on a major road. You don't want people spending all their time driving, reading your billboard. But at least, if you can say, here's the person's name and here's the phone number or contact information for the transplant center. Car signs can be a great way to spread the word. So again, the blood type, not super important, but just saying what the name is, email address or phone number. T-shirts can be a good way to spread the word and start a conversation, especially if you're out and about, and you can, give one to friends, family, things like that. Business cards are another way that you can, you'd be able to hand them out or leave them at a, business if they were willing to do so, things like that. And then use your connections. So, this recipient reached out to their alumni association and said, hey, I need a transplant. Can you put something up on the social media? So there was a little article blurb saying, hey, this person needs a transplant. And so then you get people who are in some way connected with you. And that can be very helpful in finding a good donor. And if you need some more ideas or resources, the National Kidney Foundation has a great website called The Big Ask, A Big Give, and that has information both for recipients who are looking for living donors and people who are considering being a living donor. The American Transplant Foundation has a website that does also have a mentorship program for recipients and living donors. And then Mass General, of course, has a website and our donor screening questionnaire at mghlivingdonors.org. So I know that was very quick, but I think that's all we got for you right now. So any questions?
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to actually go ahead and stop sharing, and I'll read out a few questions that we've received from some of our attendees. The first one I have is for any of you to answer. We have a participant who mentioned, I'm on the non-active list, but still accruing time. So if things go south and I ultimately need a kidney down the road, will the time still be counted? So this person was on dialysis for 18 months, but then the kidneys improved and are no longer on dialysis.
So I can take that. Yes, a person who has been placed on the list has had at least initiated dialysis or had one measurement of a GFR of 20% or less. And once placed on the list, patients, if they're inactive, they continue to accrue waiting time. So that waiting time still counts. Now, if your physician believes that your kidney recovered and you do not need a kidney transplant, we do not recommend staying on the waiting list. But if they believe that your kidney is not perfect and in the future you will likely need a kidney transplant, it's very reasonable to stay on the waiting list. And I've seen patients on the waiting list for 10 years. If they have a GFR, even sometimes fluctuates back above 20, you're still accruing waiting time as inactive. But we will maintain inactive status for all patients who do not need a transplant. So we don't believe you would benefit from it at this point. That's why we would make you inactive. I don't know your situation, obviously, but that would be an example if it was a patient of ours.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Elias. And the next question we have is, once removed from a donor, what is the shelf life of a living kidney? I don't know, Dr. Safa, if you want to answer that question.
Sure. So for deceased donor kidney transplant, we like to put them in within 24 hours, but they can be put on a pump for 48 hours, and we have records going more than that. We like to do it as soon as possible, but the kidneys are pretty resilient. We all know they're cool, but they're really resilient as well. I think the question may be alluding to the fact out of worry of the kidney being taken out from somewhere on the West Coast and being shipped to or flown to Mass General, would that be okay? Would it still function immediately? And the answer is yes. It's called the living donor advantage. And there were studies about that, and even the kidneys that were the longest trips and from the oldest donor, they still function immediately. There is no worry about the immediate kidney function for kidneys that are done through the paired exchange or the swap program, just because the kidney was flown over to Mass General from UCSF, for example, or from San Diego, let's say.
Yeah, well, thank you. And then another question we have is there a maximum age to receive a kidney transplant? This would be for a person who is active and relatively healthy.
The sky is the limit. We don't have a maximum age for recipients.
Perfect, thank you. And then one other question we have is, I thought that a living donor's blood type must be a match. Two of the donors for this patient were confirmed not a match in this presentation. However, it was mentioned that a couple of times the blood type is not necessary, the match is not necessary. So if you guys can elaborate a little further on that.
Elizabeth, you want to take that?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, if there is a donor who is the same blood type, that's ideal, because then they can donate directly, unless there's other issues that are preventing that direct donation. But it shouldn't be a reason where you're only, if you're blood type O, you're only looking for a donor who's blood type O, because we have the, the paired exchange options. So yes, ideally, would it be helpful if an O recipient had an O donor? Yes, but any other one, any other donor, if they're healthy and, and they look good, then, don't stop a potential donor from coming forward just because of blood type.
So this is where we do the swap. So if somebody is a blood type A who wants to donate to someone who's blood type B, we can in essence have find another pair. And that's what as Qasim mentioned, we're part of the largest paired exchange or swap exchange system in the country. And we work with many other centers where a blood type A donor will find a blood type A recipient, and we will give that kidney that direction, because that recipient has a blood type B donor who doesn't match them. So we do these swaps. So to donate directly, ideally you need a match, but if you are willing to donate to someone else for your loved one to get a kidney from someone else, we will find a swap and we will make it work.
Great, thank you, Dr. Elias. And is there an exception with blood type B?
So the exception that I mentioned is the advantage for blood type B patients to get kidneys of certain types of A. This is what's called non-A1. So A is multiple types of A. The A1 is the most common. And the reason we cannot transplant A kidneys into B patients, because a patient whose blood type B has antibody against A. So they will reject that kidney right away. Now, if the antibody levels in that patients are low enough, number one. Number two, if the donor is not A1, which most of anti-A antibodies are against A1, this would be an opportunity to do these transplants with a non-A1. So that's the exception, because blood type B, and that exception has come out about for deceased donor kidneys primarily through CAS that implemented in 2014, as I mentioned, and primarily because there's a lot of blood type B patients are waiting the longest. And as I said, many of them are African Americans, which disadvantage them.
Great, thank you, Dr. Elias. And Dr. Slav, I have a question for you as to how long on average does it take to find a paired sharing donor?
So it depends on the donor blood, the recipient blood type and the donor blood type, and what is the reason for the incompatible pair, whether it's only blood type or whether it's antibodies. It adds an extra step to the process where the pair has to be entered in this swap program, but it's for sure shorter than just waiting waiting on dialysis for a deceased donor kidney transplant if the pair is incompatible.
I'd say most relatively uncomplicated pairs, so people who don't have so many antibodies that there's only a handful of potential donors in the country who would be compatible. If it's just, oh, I'm blood type O is the recipient and my donor's blood type A, the paired exchange program tries to get everybody transplanted within a year of being entered into the program. It can be much shorter than that. And again, yeah, if there's somebody who has a lot of antibodies, it might be a little bit longer, but that's sort of the goal, is within a year.
Great, thank you. And then Elizabeth, do we have a total number of living donor transplants at MGH compared to the region by any chance?
Over time or per year?
There's no clarification on that. So I would
I
say
don't know. I don't know
I
total
can
over.
jump in and help you. So we've done the most in the region living donor wise historically.
Mhm.
This over the past 3 years, we've done the most. And this year so far, we've done more than 32 living donor kidney transplant, which is the most in the whole region. So as again, we have the largest living donor kidney transplant program, and we have in the region, and we have the largest swap program in the region as well.
Perfect. So I think that concludes, there's one more question we have from one of the attendees. They mentioned that I've been on dialysis for almost 5 years and I'm type B and I have an antibody that reduces my comparability. So rated at 95%, what are the chances of a match? And this participant has never had a transfusion or received an organ.
Do you want me to take it now or?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you have if you're on the list for a deceased donor, you still have chances to getting kidney transplant. You'll get some point based on your sensitization status with 95%. What is the percentage on when it will happen at year 7, at year 6, at year 7.5? It's really tough to tell. The other part of the question, whether how you got the antibodies, if you are, it's Robert. So transfusions, we say pregnancy in women, previous transplant if you've been transplanted before, and sometimes weirdly infections can cause these antibodies to happen. Like you get a virus, you get a pneumonia, you just activate your immune system, and among the stuff the immune system will activate against will be these HLA antibodies. So it happens, unfortunately. Your best shot to getting off the list is getting a living donor kidney transplant.
Great, well, thank you, everyone. So that was our last question of the day, and we've concluded our webinar for tonight. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to contact us through any of the other social media channels or the email inbox for kidney transplant. But if there's anything else, please feel free to contact us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Have a great evening.